Hello knitting friends, Jacqueline here from Jack Knits, and let's talk about this awful curling we sometimes experience in our knitting. Why does this happen and what can we do to prevent it? Let's talk about that in this video. Okay, we've all experienced this, right? We are working on a project and we're just so frustrated because our edges are curling so much in our knitting, and we often see this with stockinette stitch. So what can we do to prevent it, and why does it happen? Well, first of all, let me tell you that it is going to happen whenever you knit stockinette stitch. Unfortunately, there is no quick tip to show you how to knit with stockinette and prevent it from curling. Now obviously this is only an issue if you are knitting stockinette flat. If you are knitting in the round like a hat or mittens or socks or anything that utilizes stockinette stitch, of course there is no problem with it curling because you are knitting it in the round. Or if you are knitting a flat garment and you are going to be seaming the edges together, that's fine too, because you're going to get rid of the curl by doing the seam. So this is really only an issue if you want to preserve a flat piece of knitting fabric and you want the stockinette stitch to be the stitch of your choice. And this is why this occurs. If you kind of think about when you're knitting a stitch, you are knitting one stitch and then you are dropping the previous stitch from the row below off of your needle. And when you do that when you're doing a knit stitch, the stitch that you are dropping off your needle falls to the back of your knitting. When you're doing a purl stitch on the back side of your stockinette stitching, the stitch that you are pulling off your needle is dropping to the front of your knitting. Therefore, all the stitches that are being dropped off are landing on the back side of your knitting, which causes a great imbalance in how much yarn is on either side of the fabric. And that causes some curling to happen. So if you are knitting one side and purling the other side continually, like you do for stockinette, that is an imbalance in your knitting where that yarn falls, and curling is going to happen. So inevitable. And even blocking is not going to help this. I know blocking can sometimes cover up a lot of sins, but if you block this, it will, once it dries, it will continue to curl again. So we have to kind of resort to some other creative ideas in order to get some smooth, flat projects with stockinette stitch. So let me show you a couple of fun ways you can add to your knitting to prevent that curling. So this is probably the idea that I use most often when I do stockinette stitch for either a baby blanket or a scarf. Is what I will do is add a garter stitch border all the way around my knitting. So that means adding a couple stitches to the beginning and end of each row where I am knitting every row, not purling, and also adding several rows to the top and bottom of my project where I am knitting in garter stitch. So this gives you a nice border for your blanket or whatever you're working on, and does prevent some curling. Now you can see that it's starting to curl up a little bit, but blocking will help with that. And the larger your project, the better it will stay flat for you. So this is a nice option, but you have to kind of think ahead a little bit, add those extra stitches to your side. It can be 3, 4, 5, however wide you want your border to be. And this is a great way to help stabilize your project and get it to lay a little bit flatter. Now, you may be working on a project, and when you are all done, you realize that your project is curling, or that stitch is curling much more than what you liked. So another great option for that is adding a crochet border around your project. Now, I know you may be thinking, well, I don't crochet, but you can learn a very simple crochet stitch very easily. If you know how to knit, you can learn how to do a simple crochet stitch. There are many YouTube videos that talk about adding a border to a blanket or anything else, and you can easily follow. Now, this also, as you can see, isn't perfect. It is starting to curl a little bit, but blocking should help this tremendously, and also again a larger project will as well. So this is a great option, like I said, as an afterthought to your project. If you completed your project, you're disappointed that it's curling more than what you would like, this is a great way to finish that. And you can be then creative. You can add a little bit of extra color like I did here, a contrasting color or the same, but you can add a little bit of a flare to your finished project, and that way it will help your project to remain flat. So a great afterthought option for stockinette curling. Another option that you might want to consider and that you may not be aware of is a stitch called the double stockinette stitch. You see how this is a beautiful stockinette stitch that we love, and the back side is also a stockinette stitch. So to create stockinette stitch on both sides, we're utilizing a double stockinette stitch. And what we're actually doing is knitting two pieces of fabric at the same time, one facing the outside of each side. So that produces obviously a double thick piece of garment. You may not like that, but it does have the advantage of having stockinette stitch on both sides. And look, it lays perfectly flat. There is no curling involved. So this is a great option if you really want that stockinette stitch. You don't want to have a border, and you're willing to go with it double thick. Think about this double stockinette stitch. It's easy to do. It only requires knitting and slip stitching, and it produces this. Now, warning, it does take more yarn. You are knitting two sides of the fabric at the same time. It's a little bit slower knitting, but it's a great thing to think about if you want to preserve that stockinette look, and this is a really fun stitch to do that. The final suggestion that I have, and you may think that this is a cop-out answer, but I don't think so, and that is choose a different stitch. I know that seems like an easy out answer, but we love the stockinette stitch. It looks so professional, and it's that classic knit look. But there are so many other stitches in the world for knitting that produce beautiful fabrics and that will not curl. So be creative. Do a search on Google or YouTube and look for a new stitch that you might want to try. Now, I have chosen to do on this swatch a seed stitch, which is basically knitting one, purling one, and then the next row doing the opposite. It kind of gives this checkerboard effect. But the reason that this does not curl is that I have an equal number of purl stitches and knit stitches on both sides of the fabric. The benefit of that is, in addition to it not curling because the stitches are nice and balanced, it is completely reversible from side to side. So that might be an added plus for you when you're knitting a scarf or blanket. You really kind of like to have both sides be pretty and attractive, so this is also fun to do. Now, you don't have to stick with seed stitches. Like I said, search for many other stitches. The key to look for is if there's purling and knitting on both sides. That will help balance it. But if you're unsure whether your stitch is going to curl or not, just knit up a swatch first, see how it lays flat, and see how happy you are with it, and you can determine if that's the stitch you want to use. So here are, of course, several examples of what you can do to prevent that curling from happening on your stockinette stitch. Inevitable, it's going to happen, but you can be creative and think outside the box a little bit and find some ways to prevent that. So I hope you found this video helpful. If so, please consider subscribing. You'll receive notifications each week all about knitting tips and techniques, new stitches, and fun patterns. Thanks for watching, everyone. Happy knitting.